Thank you everyone for joining us today and those who'll be watching this online. We're so delighted for our Emerging Scholar series to have Kristina Kokorelias, who is a fifth-year student in her PhD program in Rehabilitation Sciences Institute at the University of Toronto. She's being supervised by Dr. Cameron. Her primary research interest is to understand how family caregivers use services to support their caregiving role across the disease trajectory, and we'll hear more about that today. Kristina's PhD research includes a study of family caregivers to individuals with Alzheimer's disease to understand caregiving phases and caregivers' corresponding needs for support across the disease trajectory. Kristina's in our collaborative specialization in the aging option, and she's also a fellow at Sunnybrook. Kristina's published several recent articles in peer-reviewed journals as first author, including the Scandinavian Journal of Caring Sciences, the Disability and Rehabilitation, Health and Healthcare in the Community, all of which just came out this year. And in 2019, she published in BMC Health Services Research and BMJ Open. So a great forward momentum for a doctoral student, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you today. Thanks so much for coming.
And thank you for your kind introduction, Esme. So today I'll be sharing a little bit of my PhD work that was supervised by Dr. Cameron. So I'll begin with a background and rationale as to why I decided to conduct work in this area, before getting into some details about my study, including the methods and most importantly, the results. I'll end with some contributions that the study makes to the literature and to the scientific and clinical community. And then I'm hoping we could end today with an opportunity to ask any questions or have some conversation in the context of what I found. So dementia is a progressive neurodegenerative disease that is said to impact 1 in 3 Canadians. Alzheimer's disease is the most common type of dementia, with the key symptoms being memory deficits, confusion, behavioral disturbances, and a gradual loss of speech. Due to these complex physical, cognitive, and mental changes that occur in someone with Alzheimer's disease, persons with the illness have a compromised independence, particularly in completing activities of daily living, such as participating in home maintenance and financial concerns, as well as personal care. The majority of people with Alzheimer's disease are cared for by male and female family members, particularly spouses and adult children. And these family caregivers provide support to people with Alzheimer's disease across the entire disease trajectory. However, numerous studies have shown that caregivers to people with Alzheimer's disease face negative health consequences. In fact, some studies suggest that caregivers to people with dementia experience more negative health consequences than caregivers to any other disease population. There's numerous studies that also suggest that despite support and services available to caregivers, that these existing support and services do not adequately meet their needs, and as a result can contribute to these negative health consequences. It's unclear in the literature, though, how caregivers make decisions around using services, not using services, or why they select some over others. At the start of my PhD, I began to look at the literature across various illness populations beyond just Alzheimer's disease to see what ways are being used that can best support family caregivers. And in my work, I came across the Timing and Right framework that was developed by Dr. Cameron, my thesis supervisor, in the context of stroke. And what this model suggests is that caregivers to people with stroke progress through various phases of caregiving that are different from clinical phases. And more so, that they progress through different care settings, as well as having different support needs at different periods of time. I then turned back to the literature to explore what we do know in the context of Alzheimer's disease caregiving, with that theoretical framework in mind. And what became clear is that caregiving is not static. Dementia and Alzheimer's disease are progressive diseases, meaning that they get worse over time and that this progression is not always linear. Therefore, caregiving experiences are constantly changing. Likewise, caregivers' interactions with the healthcare system change. Similarly, the availability of support and services seem to change depending on where the caregiver is in the illness trajectory. What became very clear is that we do not know how to best support Alzheimer's disease caregivers over time. With that, I began to explore areas in the literature that I could contribute to, and I identified 4 key gaps. The first is the phases caregivers experience in the caring and disease trajectory, beyond just those that stem from a clinical perspective. The second is a lack of understanding of the timely delivery of supports and services. Third, as I mentioned, we don't know enough about the decision-making process that caregivers undergo to select services. As more and more male caregivers take on the caregiving role, it also became important that we consider gender differences in the timely support and service needs of caregivers to persons with Alzheimer's disease, as the majority of the literature so far focused on female caregivers. So this brought me to one of my PhD studies that I'm sharing today. And so the purpose of this work was to better understand the experiences of family caregivers, to identify the caregiver-identified phases of caregiving throughout the entire Alzheimer's disease trajectory, as well as the corresponding caregiver-identified needs for support at those particular phases. The secondary aim was to better understand the health and social care service decision-making process of spousal and adult children caregivers over time. To do so, I set out to answer 4 research questions. The first was to identify the caregiver-identified phases of caregiving in regard to the changing Alzheimer's disease and caregiving trajectory. The second was, what are the support needs within these identified caregiver phases? And the third was, how do the phases of caregiving influence decision-making regarding health and social care service use over time? Lastly, I wanted to see if the phases of caregiving, their support needs, or the decision-making process varied by gender. To conduct this study, I decided to follow a constructivist grounded theory approach guided by Shermez. This is largely because I viewed caregiving and decision-making as a process and wanted to come up with a conceptual framework of what caregiving over time would look like. The participants in my study were spousal and adult children caregivers, all which resided in Toronto, Ontario. And Toronto was selected for pragmatic reasons, because I was a student at the University of Toronto at the time, but also because of the wide range of services available in the area, and likewise, the different cultural and ethnicity backgrounds that are found in this city. Data was collected through semi-structured interviews that occurred either in person, by telephone, or video conferencing, depending on the participant's preference. And within each interview, I did something known as member checking, and I'll explain a little bit more about how I did that later on. Data analysis was conducted using a constant comparison analysis, where previous research was compared to new research as it came in this iterative cycle, with a constant comparing of different parts of the findings to previous parts and then future parts. The interview guide was semi-structured, but I made sure that with each participant, I touched upon 4 key topics. These 4 topics were the overall experiences and responsibilities of caregivers and how they changed over time, the thoughts on the availability, effectiveness, and use of supports received by the care recipient and the caregiver over the illness trajectory. I also explored the factors that influence decision-making regarding support and service use. And I also asked caregivers about any support, training, or resources that the caregiver would have liked to receive at any point of time. As mentioned, I conducted member checking throughout my interviews. And this meant that as the interview was going on, I would pause and repeat back what I was interpreting from the participants' experiences back to the participants, and that allow them the opportunity to add any further insight or disagree with my interpretation, and we will talk that through. So what did I find? Well, in total, I had 4 groups of caregivers. I had equal numbers of husbands, sons, wives, and daughters. And this was through some of our purposeful sampling technique, as I wanted to have equal numbers of males and females so that I can do some of that gender analysis. We had a mean age of 64.8 years, but my participants varied, with the youngest being 34 and the oldest being 92. My participants reported various income, but as you can see, the majority of my participants reported an income of over $50,000, which at the time was the average mean income in the city of Toronto. Likewise, the majority of my participants were educated in post-secondary degrees, including advanced degrees, including master's degrees, as well as doctors of dentistry. Only 20 of my participants had previous caregiving experience, and none of these caregivers had cared for someone with Alzheimer's disease before. We also were able to purposely sample and get various lengths of time caregivers were providing care due to Alzheimer's disease. So we had caregivers who were providing care for as little as 1 year or as much as over 7 years. And what I found is that caregiver experiences outline a specific trajectory of the caregiving experiences. Particularly, there was 5 phases of caregiving that caregivers described progressing through over the caring and disease trajectory, and that these caregiving identified phases largely had to do with their key responsibilities. Each of these phases also had corresponding support and service needs. With regards to the decision-making process, I found that caregivers select services to help them reach their goals of care at each stage. And of course, these goals of care evolve over the caregiving and disease trajectory. At the same time, there's a variety of practical factors that influence caregivers' decision-making process over time. And these practical factors likewise change at each of these different phases. With regards to the phases, support needs, service needs, and decision-making process, we actually found no gender differences between how the males and females were selecting services or how they describe their experiences. I'll now begin and briefly describe each caregiving phase in a little bit more detail. The first caregiving phase was entitled Monitoring Initial Symptoms. And this is the phase where caregivers really began describing, noticing some subtle changes in their family member, particularly with difficulties with short-term memory or concentration that impacted their daily obligations, such as their family member no longer being able to work or volunteer like they used to. Caregivers at this phase provided emotional support to that person regarding those changes that they also were noticing, but as well as tangible assistance. So providing things such as reminders. Caregivers at this phase described really needing education and informational support, particularly around normal aging and cognitive impairment. But this was made in retrospect. At this phase, caregivers described not knowing that a cognitive impairment was occurring. With regards to decision-making, caregivers actually did not use services. And they described not using services largely because they did not know that something was wrong, or because they did not identify as a caregiver at this phase, and therefore did not believe that the existing caregiver support services or that the medical services available to them would be helpful. Caregivers described though, that in hindsight, they would have appreciated educational services, particularly those that would educate them about normal aging versus something like dementia or other forms of cognitive impairment. Because if they had this education, they think that they would have been able to better monitor the symptoms and identify what they were. Caregivers described really wanting to maintain a positive outlook as this was happening, and really do so that they could support the care recipient emotionally and physically. They believe that if they had more education at this time, it would help them maintain that positive outlook because they would better understand what was happening. Eventually, when the symptoms did not go away, caregivers began to reach out to diagnostic services, largely family physicians and memory clinics, that help the caregiver help the care recipient receive either an informal diagnosis followed immediately by the formal diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, or in some cases, they received the diagnosis of dementia, and it was only a few years later that they received the formal diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. In this phase, caregivers describe really wanting to know what Alzheimer's disease was, how it differed from dementia, and what type of services were available. In terms of support, caregivers largely spoke about this need for a resource navigator to help them navigate the existing services and help them navigate the diagnostic process. Caregivers described, as I mentioned, that their goals were really to learn about Alzheimer's disease, but they wanted to do so in a way that would help them maintain a sense of normalcy. Participants described this period as a new normal, and they will hope that with further information that they would be better able to find out what this new normal was and how they could incorporate now this Alzheimer's disease diagnosis into their daily lives. There was also practical factors that really impacted what type of diagnostic services they selected at first. And the first was really about selecting a healthcare provider that was familiar with the care recipient. And as a result of that, most did first turn to either their primary care physician or their family members if they differed. And the second was a willingness to accept the changes in the care recipient's symptoms. Participants described this phase as occurring at various lengths of time because they had to come to the recognition that the symptoms they were previously describing in the initial symptoms phase were not going away and that something medically could be wrong. In the third phase of caregiving, which we entitled Assisting with Instrumental Activities of Daily Living, so as I mentioned, things such as household management, financial management, working, or volunteering, caregivers began supporting those roles even more. Caregivers began to lean on social support for assistance. Particularly, they relied on social support for emotional support, but also information about what to expect. This is the point where caregivers really describe knowing that Alzheimer's disease was progressive, that it would not go away, and they really were looking for information so that they could predict their next steps in this caregiving journey. To help meet those support needs, caregivers largely attended support or educational groups, primarily at the Alzheimer's Society, local hospitals, or even within their own peer networks, where they would begin to realize others that they were interacting with also were caregiving. The caregivers described that when they were selecting services, they really did so that they could develop the skills so that they can continue to provide care, but as well as manage the emotional toll that becoming a caregiver had taken on them. Caregivers also set the goal to maintain social connections. Caregivers describe that since becoming a caregiver or receiving the diagnosis, they found themselves preoccupied with the caregiving role and not connecting to their friends, neighbors, or coworkers as much. Therefore, attending support and educational groups became a sense of social connectedness to the caregivers. Caregivers also attributed the fact that they attended support and education groups to the fact that to not needing any other services, because the support groups and talking with their peers served to meet all their needs at that point of time. But when deciding between different support groups or education groups or workshops, there was a few practical factors that came to mind. The first was largely around cost. Caregivers at this point of time did not want to pay for services, so they would purposely select services that were free. The location and the timing of the event or the session was also particularly important. Caregivers described trying to balance their working relationships as well as other family commitments, and therefore, if the event took place at a time that wasn't convenient for them or at a location that was very far away, they would not attend. Also surprisingly was that caregivers really wanted professionals that were specific to Alzheimer's disease and had that specific Alzheimer's disease training. Caregivers described a frustration where they would attend a support group or an educational session that was just for dementia broadly. At this point, they really wanted someone to talk to them about Alzheimer's disease and particularly tell them what they could expect. Eventually, caregivers began to provide assistance with basic activities of daily living, so things such as bathing, toileting, and feeding. And caregivers describe this point of time as the point where they were at their maximum level of care that they could provide to the care recipient. Now, caregivers not yet at this phase also described eventually seeing themselves being at this phase and eventually needing to provide this level of support. And caregivers now described an increased need for tangible support, so hands-on support from community supports. And they did so because they wanted to be able to maintain caregiving at home for as long as possible. So in turn, they turned to local home and community care organizations, both publicly funded and privately funded. The caregivers described that the reason that they wanted to remain caregiving in the home was so that they could maintain a relationship with the person with dementia, and that having someone else assist with some of this tangible support would allow them to do so. They also described this feeling of self-efficacy. They wanted to learn from other professionals so that they could continue providing this level of care and knowing how to best care for their care recipient. Of course, numerous factors now came into place as to which home and community care organizations they selected, what services within those organizations they selected, and when and why they used them. The first is this idea of the optimization of scarce resources. While some participants were affluent enough to be able to pay for any services they needed, the majority of my participants were not. Whereas previously, caregivers described not being willing to pay for services, in this phase, almost all caregivers described that they were willing to pay for services, but due to a lack of unlimited funds, they had to choose which services they pay for and which ones they don't. What we found is that caregivers were more likely to not pay for services that they could do, such as home care or even respite. And by home care, I mean situations like cleaning the home. But they were willing to pay for things like personal care. So having assistance with bathing their care recipient or feeding their care recipient or medication management. Participants largely also described long wait times. And because of these long wait times, they were deciding which services they should pay for, so the ones with longer wait times, and which ones they would just wait until they were able to access them. Participants also described a variability in care quality between the different home care providers and a lack of continuity between who they were seeing. And eventually, in some cases, caregivers became frustrated with this variability in care and either decided to not go with that service or that care provider or seek another home care organization that could provide them care. Similarly, the coordination of services and the scheduling of services also were a large influence. For caregivers, they needed someone to come into the home when they were available to supervise care. They also needed someone to come into the home at different regular schedules, and that depended on the individual circumstances and the care recipient's needs. So that also played a role into which services they selected. And lastly, family contact or conflict also really influenced the decision to use services. Caregivers described wanting to keep the family member at home, but feeling resentful in some situations of other family members who were not able to support them in doing so. In other cases, family members described using home and community care as a result of having conflict with family members who were saying comments such as, "You're providing too much care. You cannot do this. You are going to burn out." However, caregivers who had family contact and another primary caregiver or secondary caregiver to help provide them care described using home and community care services in a different way, where it would just supplement the care that they were already providing and then the care that the other family members were providing. Now, the last phase of caregiving described by participants was preparing for the future. And what was interesting is, despite some of my caregivers only having provided care for someone with Alzheimer's disease for as short as 1 year, all participants in the study described that long-term care or institutionalized placement was going to be in their future. Caregivers began to question their ability to care for the care recipient at home. And in turn, they wanted more information and support regarding what services are out there, particularly with assisted living and the wait lists that they've heard. From using the support groups and their peer networks in the previous phases, caregivers were sharing stories to me about horrors of how long it could take to be placed on a long-term care waiting list, or how long you would wait on that waiting list. Caregivers described anywhere between 3 and 5 years. So caregivers really wanted support and education from a trained professional who could help dispel some of these myths, assist them with getting on that wait list and the processes, as well as inform them of what the realities would look like. Therefore, the service need caregivers projected they would be needing would be long-term care facilities. And caregivers described selecting long-term care facilities because they wanted to maintain a relationship with other family members. Caregivers described that they questioned if caregiving had overcome some of their other family relationships, and that due to caregiving so intensely and the conflict that sometimes involved, that if they placed their family member in long-term care, then perhaps it would provide an opportunity for them to reestablish those relationships. Secondly, caregivers also describe this interesting idea of setting their own goals. Whereas up until now, caregivers described goals of care related to caring for the care recipient, caregivers describe goals of their own that they would like to pursue if their loved one was placed in long-term care facilities. And these goals ranged from better self-care to traveling goals or returning back to the workforce. However, caregivers also described a variety of factors they were considering when deciding what long-term care facility to place their family member into. The first was largely pragmatic, and it was related to the policies, procedures, and processes of joining that long-term care home. So things such as wait lists, visitor policies, as well as the situation and characteristics of the care recipient that would allow them to be admitted to certain facilities. The second was location. Despite wanting their own goals, even if they were talking about travel, participants all wanted a location that was close to their homes, that they could easily access to still maintain that caregiving role and have that constant contact with their family member. Participants also described financial concerns. Whereas some participants described that they were willing to pay for certain homes and not others, some participants were in a situation where they described being on a fixed income or limited budget, and that reduced the options that they could choose or force them into waiting for a publicly funded long-term care home. However, most of the participants describe this idea of long-term care being expensive but necessary. So again, this was another service they were willing to pay for if needed. The reputation of the facility also was largely discussed. And the reputation of the facility came from information they got from others in their peer network, so either from their support groups or other caregivers that they knew. Participants did not describe looking at reputation of facilities from anyone else. And lastly, the accessibility of the long-term care facility was discussed. Particularly, caregivers described concerns over the language and the culture of the home. At this point, some caregivers described that their family member had reverted back to their mother tongue that was not English and wanted a home that could support the language and communication abilities of their care recipient in that particular language. Likewise, physical accessibility was also discussed. And by this, caregivers described things such as making sure that the floors were carpeted in case their family member fell, or ensuring things such as that walkers that their family member now needed were able to fit through the hallways and they weren't narrow enough. So as you can see, this study provided really large insight into those 4 large areas of literature that we were missing before. And I was lucky enough to get a large sample of participants, especially for a qualitative study, with really in-depth findings and data collection that provided insights of participants' experiences at various lengths of time of providing care. Similarly, the study used a novel approach to member checking. Whereas typically member checks are done after analysis has been completed, and the researcher then goes and presents the findings to certain participants, which we did do, we also took the added step to not overburden caregivers in case they weren't available at another time, and to ensure the accuracy of our phases and the rest of the content, so that in each interview, as I mentioned, I was repeating my findings and my ideas of the interview back to them at that one point of time. However, all research is not without its limitations. And so in this study, we had a primarily homogeneous sample related to gender binary. So all participants identified as a male or female, husband, wife, son, or daughter, as well as race. The majority of my participants were Caucasian. And lastly, with socioeconomic status. As mentioned, over half of my participants reported a higher than average income for the city of Toronto. And this could be due to some of our purposeful sampling techniques, where I was more so concerned for the sake of the study and getting the perspectives of caregivers providing care at various lengths of time, and also purposely sampling so I could have equal number of male and female caregivers. Participants were also asked to discuss their caregiving experiences retrospectively. And as mentioned, I had some caregivers who were providing care for over 7 years. And therefore, there may be issues with recall bias or them not accurately remembering some of the things that happened previously. Likewise, caregivers in the very early phases of providing care were asked to predict what they would need in the future. And lastly, the use of telephone interviews has been debated in qualitative research. And that is because we are unable to see some of the body language or environmental cues that happen during the research process that could be as sources of data. This telephone interviews occurred even before the pandemic, when I was able to go to the homes or to meet caregivers elsewhere. Like I said, we also gave them the options of video conferencing, but we let the caregivers select which interview method they chose. And telephone interviews really allowed me to reach those homebound caregivers. So this study makes some unique contributions to the scientific and clinical literature. The first is that this study demonstrates that changing support and service needs of caregivers to individuals with Alzheimer's disease across the trajectory Up until this point, we have only known the clinical phases, or researchers have begun to think that what the other caregiving phases may be, but this information has not stemmed from the perspective of caregivers themselves. Like mentioned earlier, this has been done in context of other diseases like stroke, but not in the context of progressive diseases like Alzheimer's disease, where things can change over time and over long periods of time. The second is that this research provides the foundation to guide future research as well as healthcare practice by suggesting the caregiver identify phases, the time support needs, so future research can then consider the effectiveness of providing the appropriate support need at a specific point of time, as well as how caregivers make service decisions over time. So this can impact healthcare practice, and that support organizations and clinicians now have a better sense of the factors that are going on that the caregivers consider for various services. And ultimately, this research can aid in the development of a caregiver support needs framework that can hopefully be used in future practice. While I'm the one presenting here today, this work could not have been done with a lot of people. So my first thank you really goes to all my participants who graciously took time out of their busy schedules to provide me insight into their daily lives. I also would like to thank Mira Redenberg, an occupational therapist that we partnered with to conduct the study early on to provide some clinical insight into the implications of my findings. Jennifer and Samantha conducted pilot studies of the interview guide with 5 caregivers each, so that we can see if these phases were even possible. Likewise, that my interview guide would be able to elicit the phases of caregiving. I'm also lucky that numerous organizations supported us with our recruitment. Similarly, this work has been published, as mentioned earlier, but with my co-authors, who were large sources of help throughout the entire research process and helped me come to my final conclusions and manuscripts. And ultimately, this work was financially supported by various organizations, including the Institute for Life Course and Aging here today, who provided me the financial means so that I can share these findings to international audiences. Thank you. And I now welcome any questions or comments, or for those watching online or remotely, my contact information is on the screen.
Well, thank you so much, Kristina. That was fascinating, and there's applause going on the screen now as we speak. I think it's quite different to think about the trajectories. Historically, you've addressed something that's been a big lack in our literature, and sometimes they don't even say what stage they are, and so you've got people who are almost bedbound versus people who are early stage. So to see that trajectory was really helpful. Everybody's muted right now, but please, we're open for questions. That's always often a very fun opportunity to share ideas, and so please, we're open. The floor is yours for the rest of the audience, and it's great to see such a big collection of people from all over. If you're shy about opening and saying a question, you can also put it in the chat, and I'm happy to read it as well. So.
And just so you know, I think I just allowed people to unmute themselves.
Yes, that helps. Right. So Jill, I see you there, but you're still muted, right? Did you have a question or a comment? Comments are welcome too.
Yeah, no, I think I'll leave it for other people, because Kristina and I've chatted a lot about this, and she's getting ready for defense. So if anybody has any questions that can help her, think about things that will help her for her defense, they're very welcome to.
I just want to say I thought it was fabulous. Thank you, Kristina. And it validated the work that we do at Acclaim Health. We provide support, education. We have a dementia info series going on right now with all this information. My question is, what I didn't really get a sense of, and maybe that wasn't part of it, is how to engage the caregivers who are resistant to all of this. Because as you said, it was retrospective. They look back, every caregiver looks back and says, I should have done this. So do you have any recommendations for how to encourage them to take on these services when they're resistant or don't understand the need?
Thank you for your question. I think what was really highlighted by my participants is the fact that sometimes they don't know what these services entail or what these services even are, especially at the beginning stages where they don't identify as a caregiver. What was unique and that I didn't share here is that when recruiting son caregivers, I wasn't recruiting in a way that suggested the term caregiver, because I found that they didn't identify with that term, even if they were providing care for 5-7 years. So that could be a suggestion, as well as just paying attention to the language that we are using when offering these services, as well as making it clear what services are available and what services may be helpful at particular points of time. As mentioned, there was a particular point of time in this for these caregivers where they really want to know what happens next. And perhaps if they did know what happens next, they could know what services may be available to help them at those phases.
Okay.
Thank you. I just want to say, do you have a better term than caregiver? Because I know the Alzheimer Society uses carers now, which I always trip over, carers. Do you have any better suggestions?
So this again was all done through a process of trial and error. One thing that I did find success with is removing all one formal label and just saying things such as, do you provide care to a parent with Alzheimer's disease? Do you assist a parent with things such as bathing, etc., and listing out some of those? Or even just broadly, are you a son with a parent to Alzheimer's disease, and do you assist them? Very broad terms, and I had better success with that. So that may be a strategy. Thank you.
And sorry, and you didn't find any gender differences in getting help?
I found no gender differences in the service needs, the support needs, nor their description of the phases, nor in their description of the factors that influence their decision-making process, no. I will say we do have a third study, so an add-on to this, where we further explore gender and relationship differences. So there are some nuances. This is more of a high-level approach, but in terms of the basic phases or caregiver support needs or service needs, no, I did not. Thank you.
Sarah, go ahead. Sarah has a long-term, you're muted actually, Sarah. So Sarah is a long-term caregiver and also a caregiver activist, so.
Oh, thanks for describing me that way. Yeah, I actually have had a little resistance personally to the term caregiver, so I was so curious to hear how you answer that question. I can relate to that. I was curious, where are people getting most of their information about Alzheimer's from? Because in my understanding, dementia is the umbrella term, and Alzheimer's disease is one form of dementia. So, yeah, it always seems to, this conversation always seems to come up at some point. So maybe you could describe where people are getting their information from, and you know, how one type of dementia might, you know, display differently, because there's just no two cases of Alzheimer's disease, which I think my mother had, are the same.
Thanks for your question, Sarah. It did come up and I think that was one of the reasons that participants were so stuck once they received the Alzheimer's diagnosis on making sure all the services were Alzheimer's focused, Alzheimer's trained professionals. Participants at the beginning, when they didn't know what was going on, really turned to the web. So the internet was a large source of information at the beginning. Eventually that translated into their peer networks. So it was really the support and education groups, but also who they met at those groups that became a source of information. And that's why later on I was hearing things such as rumors about different care homes or wait lists. These came from those peers and weren't necessarily from, say, more credible sources like the Alzheimer's Society or healthcare professionals. Thank you.
Kristina, you gave a little bit of a hint to your third paper, which is the gender analysis. Do you want to give some sort of high-level insight into some of your key findings there?
So what we did there is we applied a gender and relationship lens to everything we had found previously, as shared today. And what I found is that sometimes gender plays a large influence at different key phases. Sometimes relationship does, and sometimes both do. But it's not enough to say one concrete statement, such as gender impacts the caregiving situation or the caregiving experience, or relationship type impacts the caregiving situation, and that this really evolves over time. I will say that in certain phases, we did see nuances. So whereas, for example, in the long-term care phase, at the last phase I described, all participants described seeing long-term care in their future, their reactions to it were very different. So wives use a very prominent quote. They consider long-term care their worst fear, and that's a quote from various participants. Whereas husbands see it as almost this inevitable, something that they don't want to do, but that they're willing to do it. And likewise, adult children seem more receptive to it than spousal caregivers. And that's just one example.
Sander?
Yes, great talk, Kristina. So I do have another question around the sex and gender, just because as my in-laws are getting older and my mother is getting older, I'm starting to think, thankfully they're healthy and doing well, but what about the role of sort of like in-laws? Because I know realistically, if something ever happens, I'm going to go to my wife and say, what should I do with my mother? Because I won't have any clue. So I'm just wondering if any of those nuances came out in the interviews around like in-laws, the role of daughter-in-laws or son-in-laws.
I think that's a great question, Sandra. And I think that's also an area for opportunity for next steps. In our recruitment, we really tried eventually to get saturation on the groups of husbands, sons, daughters, and wives. What was interesting is it was only in retrospect after we conducted the interviews and looked at some of the demographic information or looked at the interview as a whole that some people who identified as daughters were actually daughter-in-laws. But at the time of the study where it only said daughters, they said, I am a daughter. And it was only either in member checking interviews way well after that they then said, oh, actually it's my husband or partner's mother. But in this study that we found saturation. So by that, I mean, we did not find any nuances with in-laws. And I think that was just because of who self-selected to be in the study as well. So perhaps if they had a really good relationship with their in-laws, that they describe themselves as being that primary caregiver, being that son or that daughter, then that's why they participated and were able to have very similar findings to the, say, biological children. But I think areas of further research in this area should especially include diverse groups of caregivers, including in-laws as well. Great.
I just have one other question, because with qualitative, you always get these great insights and ideas, but sometimes, a purpose of qualitative research is to then inform a future study, maybe from a quantitative standpoint. Mm-hmm. So thinking about the things that you found, would you have included any quantitative measures to see if there might have been any differences, or if you were to design a study, what would be your outcomes? What would sort of be your predictors to sort of maybe predict successful trajectories of care?
Mm-hmm. So what we did do that I didn't describe is we did collect some demographic information in the form of quantitative findings. So we did do things such as caregiver burden scales, caregiver involvement scales. So we do have that. But again, for the purpose of the study, they did not provide anything beyond context of what was going on to the caregiving situations. In terms of future studies, I think it would be really important for intervention-based work that could be then analyzed both qualitatively as well as quantitatively. So seeing if providing support and the type of support identified at these different particular points of time actually make a difference to the caregiving situation over time. So things like, does it increase information? Does it have any impact on care quality? or outcomes to the care recipient? Perhaps does it influence, if we provide support earlier on at these time-based phases, long-term care placement? Is there any change there? As well as I would say overall caregiver burden. I know we've moved away from that term, but just this idea of caregiver wellness. So comparing pre-intervention to post-intervention as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for the great questions and great discussion, and especially to Kristina for doing such a solid presentation and very professionally done. But yes, round of applause all around. We would really like you to complete the evaluation forms. So they're helpful for us at the Institute, but they're also very helpful for Kristina and other students going on to academic positions, because they are putting together a portfolio of their presentation skills. And as you can see, Kristina really polished presentation, and so it would be great if you could fill it out. I believe it should be in the chat. Yes, so in the chat at the bottom, there's a form. If you could just take a few minutes to fill it out, that'll be helpful. And we shared that information with Kristina for her package. So thank you again for a fabulous presentation, and Jill for supervising this. We're really excited about what you've done and what you have going forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Right, take care. Bye-bye.